The faint glow of a street lamp flickered through the fogged window of Paulo Ferreira's modest apartment in a quiet Boston neighborhood. It was 2003, and autumn painted the streets in shades of gold and orange. But inside his living room, the air was heavy, almost suffocating. At 28, Paulo, a university literature professor at Boston University, sat in a worn armchair, his trembling hands clutching a cold cup of tea. His sunken eyes, those of a man who hadn't slept well, stared at an email open on his laptop. A cutting message from an ex-friend, Lucas, accusing him of being ungrateful after months of emotional manipulation. The silence of the night amplified the weight of words Paulo knew all too well. Paulo was brilliant, with lectures that inspired students to dive into Shakespeare and Poe. But his life outside the classroom was a cycle of toxic relationships. Since adolescence, he had attracted people who diminished him. Friends like Lucas, who praised him only to later demand favors, or colleagues who blamed him for their own mistakes. His low self-esteem, rooted in a childhood where praise was rare, convinced him he deserved such treatment. Each broken friendship left him more isolated, more certain that his worth depended on others' approval. In that moment, with Lucas's email burning on his screen, Paulo hit rock bottom. Outside, the distant rustle of leaves blown by the wind mingled with the occasional sound of a car passing over the cobblestone street. Boston, with its history of resilience and renewal, seemed to mock Paulo, who couldn't find the strength to rise. He recalled a student who, in a recent class, had asked, "Professor, why do the heroes in your stories always find redemption?" The question had struck him like a mirror. He taught about overcoming, yet he was trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse that choked him. That night, something shifted. Paulo picked up a notebook and, with a hesitant hand, wrote, "I deserve more." It was a whisper, but a beginning. The journey toward therapy, self-discovery, and healthy relationships was about to begin, though the path would be long, marked by internal and external confrontations that would test his courage. As rain began to fall, Paulo looked out the window, feeling, for the first time, a spark of hope in his heart. The autumn of 2003 embraced Boston with a chilly breeze carrying the scent of damp leaves and roasted coffee from the city's scattered cafes. Paulo Ferreira, 28, walked along the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, his worn wool coat shielding him from the biting wind. As a university professor at Boston University, he spent his days amid crowded classrooms and red brick corridors, where his lectures on American literature captivated students with passion and insight. But beyond the lectern, Paulo carried an invisible burden, a cycle of toxic relationships that eroded his self-esteem, shaping him into someone who sought validation from those who diminished him. Paulo was tall, with deep brown eyes and tousled brown hair that hinted at sleepless nights. The son of Portuguese immigrants who arrived in Boston in the 1970s, he grew up in a home where effort was prized, but affection was measured. His father, Carlos, a retired mechanic with calloused hands, taught him discipline, while his mother, Teresa, a quiet seamstress, rarely praised him, leaving him with the sense that he was never enough. This foundation shaped Paulo, making him vulnerable to manipulative friends like Lucas Almeida, a college acquaintance who had re-entered his life as an emotional parasite. Lucas, 29, was charming, with an easy smile and a knack for turning favors into obligations. He showed up on weekends, asking for help with assignments or money, always with promises of paying back later. Paulo, eager for acceptance, complied, but each interaction left him emptier. Another friend, Sofia Mendez, 27, a former student turned close friend, used praise to subtly criticize him, as when she said at a party, "You're so talented, but you need to work harder to keep up with others." These relationships, which Paulo saw as valuable connections, were in fact chains dragging him down. The backdrop of Boston in the 2000s added layers to Paulo's struggle. The city, blending colonial history with technological modernity, buzzed with ambitious students and professionals. Boston University, with its imposing buildings and crowded libraries, was a refuge for Paulo, but also a mirror of his insecurities. He watched colleagues laughing in groups while he isolated himself, convinced he didn't deserve genuine company. The clanging of trolleys along the streets and the aroma of roasted chestnuts at corners contrasted with the emptiness he felt inside. The first challenges emerged as Paulo began to notice the impact of his relationships. In a class, a student named James asked about Hemingway's resilience, and Paulo, inspired, spoke of overcoming, but his voice faltered as he recalled Lucas calling him weak the night before. After class, he found an anonymous note on his desk. "You deserve more, Professor." The simple message unsettled him. Who had left it? Was it praise or a taunt? He tucked the paper away, confused but intrigued. That night at home, Paulo opened an old notebook and wrote about his pain, something he hadn't done since adolescence. Loneliness struck when Lucas called, demanding help with a report and threatening to cut ties if Paulo refused. He hesitated, heart racing, but hung up the phone for the first time. The small act brought relief and fear. He knew he needed to change, but didn't know where to start. The city slept outside, the lights of the Charles River reflecting on the dark water, as Paulo stared at the notebook, sensing an uncertain path beginning to open. The next day, during a break at the university, Paulo crossed paths with Dr. Elena Carter, a guest psychologist lecturing on mental health. At 40, with graying hair and a welcoming gaze, she noticed the tension in his face. "You seem to carry a lot, Paulo," she said gently. He forced a smile, but her observation lingered. Perhaps therapy was an option, but the idea of exposing his weaknesses terrified him. As he walked through the university gardens, the anonymous note fell from his pocket. He picked it up, reading again. "You deserve more." For the first time, he considered it might be true. The chilly November wind swept through Boston's streets, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and the muffled clatter of trolleys cutting through the city. Paulo Ferreira walked slowly down Charles Street, the anonymous note burning in his pocket like a secret he dared not reveal. The decision to hang up on Lucas the previous night, rejecting his demand, had left an uneasy void in his chest. At 28, the university professor felt the weight of years of manipulation beginning to crack, but the fear of being alone kept him hesitant. The idea of therapy, planted by his chance encounter with Dr. Elena Carter, was growing in his mind, yet confronting his emotions felt like an insurmountable mountain. On the Boston University campus, Paulo's routine was both a refuge and a mirror of his struggles. His students loved his literature classes, but he noticed curious glances when he isolated himself during breaks. Sofia Mendez, the former student turned constant presence, approached after a lecture, her sweet smile masking a sharp intent. "Paulo, I heard you fought with Lucas," she said, adjusting her scarf. "He's upset, you know. Maybe you should apologize." The suggestion, laced with false concern, churned Paulo's stomach. He mumbled an excuse and walked away, feeling guilty for something he hadn't done. Sofia, with her skill at shifting blame, was another link in the chain that bound him. The conflict escalated that night when Lucas found him at a cafe near the university. The friend, with narrowed eyes and a voice thick with resentment, leaned against the table. "You think you can just abandon me like that? After everything I've done for you?" Paulo, hands sweating, tried to explain he needed space, but Lucas laughed mockingly. "Space? You're nothing without me." The words cut like blades, reigniting the low self-esteem Paulo had carried since childhood. He left the cafe with his heart racing, his face hot with humiliation, but also with a spark of anger. The first time he felt something beyond submission. At home, the apartment's silence amplified his thoughts. Paulo picked up the notebook where he'd written, "I deserve more," and added, "But how?" The answer came the next morning when a university email announced a series of mental health lectures, including one by Elena Carter. Intrigued, he decided to attend. In the crowded room, Elena spoke about recognizing toxic patterns and seeking help, her words resonating like a beacon. After the lecture, she approached him again. "I saw you in the audience, Paulo. You seemed troubled." He hesitated but confessed, "I can't say no to people. They hurt me and I let them." Elena nodded, offering an experimental session. "Let's start slow," she said. "You deserve to understand your worth." The interaction with Elena sparked a new internal conflict. Paulo wanted to change, but the idea of exposing his weaknesses terrified him. He began noticing patterns. Lucas showing up only when he needed something, Sofia praising only to criticize later. In a class, while discussing Edgar Allan Poe's loneliness, Paulo paused, his eyes welling up. A student, James, raised his hand. "Professor, you seem to understand this on a personal level." The innocent observation caught him off guard. He forced a smile and deflected, but the question lingered. Did his students see beyond his facade? Beyond the university, Boston offered moments of reflection. Walking through Boston Common, Paulo watched families laughing and couples holding hands, feeling an emptiness. He sat on a bench, the wind tousling his hair, and pulled the anonymous note from his pocket. "You deserve more." Whoever wrote it knew his pain. The doubt consumed him, but it also motivated him. He He scheduled a session with Elena for the end of the week, a trembling step towards self-discovery. That night, Lucas called again, insisting on a meeting. Paulo, heart in his throat, refused. "I can't do this anymore, Lucas," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor. The silence on the other end was followed by a sharp insult before the call ended. Paulo dropped the phone, hands shaking, but felt a subtle relief. He knew Sofia and others like her would follow, testing his resolve. The journey to break the cycle was just beginning, and Boston, with its historic streets and cold winds, would witness his struggle to rediscover himself. The dense December fog enveloped Boston like a shroud, the streetlights casting eerie shadows across the damp streets of Back Bay. Paulo Ferreira, his coat pulled tight against the cold, walked toward Dr. Elena Carter's office, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and apprehension. It was a Wednesday, days after his confrontation with Lucas, and his refusal to yield to the demands still echoed like a fragile reverberation in his mind. Boston University, on break, felt like a silent maze, and the anonymous note in Paulo's pocket, "You deserve more," seemed to pulse like a secret he feared to unravel. The session with Elena began with a tense silence. She, with her piercing gaze and calm voice, asked Paulo to talk about his relationships. He described Lucas, Sofia, and the echoes of a cold childhood, the words spilling out like fragments of an open wound. "I always thought I had to prove my worth," he admitted, avoiding her eyes. Elena jotted something down, the scratch of her pen cutting through the air, before looking up. "What if that note is a sign of something bigger, Paulo? Something you don't yet understand?" The enigmatic question planted a seed of doubt. Before he could respond, she assigned a task. Write a letter to himself, listing qualities he valued but never acknowledged. "Keep it," she instructed. "It might reveal more than you imagine." The twist came that night in the quiet of his apartment. Paulo, with trembling hands, wrote in his notebook, kindness, intelligence, resilience. Each word was an effort, wrested from years of self-criticism. When he finished, tears streamed down his face, and a revelation struck him like lightning. He had never allowed himself to believe he deserved self-love. But as he closed the notebook, a strange noise came from the window, a subtle scratching, as if someone were outside. He approached, heart racing, and saw a shadow flee down the street. The anonymous note gained new weight. What if it wasn't just an internal reflection, but a warning? The tension heightened the next day when Sofia barged into his office at the university, her face twisted with anger. "Lucas said you betrayed him," she spat, eyes narrowed. "What are you hiding?" Paulo, still shaken by the letter, tried to defend himself, but Elena's words echoed. "Your worth doesn't depend on them." With a trembling voice he replied, "I won't let myself be manipulated anymore, Sofia." Her shock was palpable, and she left muttering threats, leaving an air of suspicion. Who had told Lucas about his refusal? The thought that they might be watching him sent a chill down his spine. Outside, Boston seemed to conspire. Walking along the Charles River, Paulo noticed a hooded man on the opposite bank, watching him before vanishing into the fog. The ice along the edges mirrored his agitated mind. The note, now a clue, suggested something larger was moving around him. Back at his apartment, he found the door ajar. Someone had been there. A notebook of his lecture notes, containing personal secrets, lay open, marked to a page with a Poe poem about betrayal. Panic seized him, but so did a fierce determination. He called Elena, scheduling an extra session, feeling the note, and the intrusions were connected. The confrontation arrived that night when Lucas and Sofia cornered him at a bar near the university, accompanied by a third man Paulo didn't recognize. "Thought you could abandon us?" Lucas snarled, his tone thick with threat. Sofia added with a cruel smile, "You don't know who you're messing with." The stranger remained silent, his eyes fixed on Paulo, heightening the tension. Paulo, with the letter in his pocket as a shield, said, "I won't be your target anymore." The response was a collective laugh, and Lucas whispered, "This will cost you." They walked away, leaving Paulo trembling, but with a certainty. Embracing his self-worth had plunged him into a dangerous game. Lying in bed, listening to the rain tapping against the window, Paulo held the note. The tension of being watched, the possibility of deeper betrayal, and the mystery of the hooded man suggested his journey of self-discovery would face dark obstacles. He knew Elena could help unravel it, but the fear of even greater twists kept him awake. Boston, with its historic streets and secrets, became the stage for a struggle that went beyond relationships, a battle for his soul. The following morning dawned gray in Boston. the December fog still hovering over the wet streets of Back Bay like a veil of uncertainty. Paulo Ferreira woke with a heavy heart, the sound of rain tapping against the window echoing the inner turmoil left by the confrontation at the bar with Lucas, Sofia, and the mysterious stranger. The anonymous note, now locked away in a drawer, felt like a beacon amid the darkness, but the sensation of being watched made him shiver. He rose, his trembling hands reaching for the notebook with the letter he'd written to himself, rereading the words: kindness, intelligence, resilience, searching for strength to face the day. At Dr. Elena Carter's office, the extra session brought temporary relief. Paulo recounted the apartment break-in, Lucas's threat, and the mysterious man, his voice faltering as he described the fear. Elena listened intently, her brow furrowing, before suggesting, "It seems you've triggered something bigger by standing up for yourself. This could be their way of intimidating you." The notion that his pursuit of self-worth had unsettled others left him stunned. She advised him to document everything, notes, strange encounters, and avoid direct confrontations until they understood the situation. Paulo left with a new journal, feeling both protected and exposed. Lucas and Sofia's reactions were swift and venomous. At the university, Sofia spread rumors among colleagues, hinting that Paulo was unstable after ditching his friends. He caught whispers in the hallways, sidelong glances, and felt the isolation he'd feared taking shape. Lucas, meanwhile, sent a cruel message. "You'll pay for humiliating me. Watch who you trust." The threat, paired with the memory of the stranger at the bar, heightened the tension. Paulo began avoiding places they frequented, like the cafe near campus, opting to eat alone in the park, where the chilly wind stung less than the judgments. His family, however, responded with growing concern. During a visit to the Dorchester townhouse where Carlos and Teresa lived, he found his parents seated at the kitchen table, the scent of baked cod filling the air. Carlos, with his rough hands crossed, asked, "What's going on, Paulo? You look scared." Teresa, her eyes moist, added, "You've always been so quiet, but now you seem lost." He hesitated but shared about the toxic friends and therapy, omitting the threats to spare them worry. Carlos frowned. "Those friends don't deserve you. But be careful who you let into your life now." Their support, though stiff, warmed Paulo, yet it also made him wonder if he could trust anyone beyond Elena. A subtle shift began to emerge. At the university, Paulo sought support from James, the perceptive student who'd noticed his vulnerability. After a class, he asked James to stay behind to discuss a project. The young man, 20, with crooked glasses and a shy smile, listened as Paulo confessed feeling watched. "Professor, I've seen a strange guy near the classroom," James said hesitantly. "Tall, hooded, looked like he was following you." The revelation sent a chill through Paulo, but it also forged a fragile bond with James, who offered to help keep an eye on campus. It was a hopeful beginning. Beyond work, Boston became a stage for adaptation. Walking through Boston Common, Paulo spotted the hooded man again, this time closer, before he vanished into the crowd. He jotted it in his journal, the tension mounting. The letter in his notebook reminded him of his worth, but the possibility of a darker game, perhaps involving Lucas and the stranger, kept him on edge. He decided to intensify sessions with Elena, scheduling weekly meetings, and started keeping his phone on at all times, just in case. That night, as the rain subsided, Paulo sat by the window, the journal open. The rejection from Lucas and Sofia had isolated him, but it also freed him from a cycle that had suffocated him. James's presence offered a glimmer of light, while Elena's guidance steadied him. Still, the hooded man and the threats hinted at more dangerous obstacles ahead. He wrote, "I'm changing, but the cost might be high." Gazing at the city's lights, Paulo felt that Boston, with its history of resilience, would witness his struggle and perhaps his redemption. Winter tightened its grip on Boston with a biting cold, the wind howling through the streets of Back Bay as snowflakes began to fall, transforming the city into a scene of icy beauty and hidden tension. Paulo Ferreira, now more vigilant, walked with his journal pressed against his chest, his eyes scanning the surroundings for the hooded man. The week following the bar confrontation brought an uneasy calm, but new challenges emerged, complicating his journey of self-discovery and thrusting him into a more dangerous path. The anonymous note, locked in his drawer, seemed to pulse like an enigma begging to be unraveled. At the university, pressure mounted when an email from the administration announced an internal investigation into inappropriate behavior among faculty. Sofia, leveraging her influence among colleagues, spread word that Paulo was involved, suggesting his personal issues made him unstable. He was summoned to a meeting with Dr. Harold Mitchell, a stern 60-year-old with a rigid posture and piercing gaze. "We've had reports of you causing discomfort, Ferreira," Mitchell said, flipping through papers. Paulo, baffled, denied it, but the suspicion left him exposed. He suspected Lucas and Sofia were behind it, using the investigation as a new weapon to undermine him. The challenge intensified outside work. One night, returning home, Paulo found his apartment ransacked, books strewn across the floor, the notebook with his letter open to a torn page. Panic seized him, but a detail stopped him cold. On the table lay a new note, scrawled in jagged letters. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The message, more direct than the last, hinted that someone knew about his sessions with Elena and was watching closely. He called her, voice trembling, and she advised filing a police report, which only heightened his anxiety. Involving the authorities might expose his vulnerability. The tension escalated with the arrival of a new figure, Daniel Ortiz, a former colleague of Lucas who resurfaced after years. Daniel, 30, with a disheveled appearance and a forced smile, approached Paulo in the university hallway, offering help to clear his reputation. "I heard about the rumors," he said, lowering his voice. "Lucas told me you're lost. I can mediate." Paulo felt a chill. Daniel was known to be as manipulative as Lucas. The offer seemed like a trap, but the pressure of the investigation made him waver. He refused, but Daniel's presence added a layer of distrust, suggesting Lucas's circle of influence was broader than he'd thought. Paulo's family also faced complications. During a call with Teresa, she mentioned that Carlos had received a strange visitor asking about Paulo. "He said he was a friend, but your father didn't like his vibe," she said, worried. Paulo's world tilted. The manipulators were closing in on his family. He visited his parents, finding Carlos frowning, holding a broken pen the visitor had left behind. "If someone's threatening you, son, let me know," Carlos rasped. Their protection moved him, but it also made him fear the consequences of his defiance. James, the allied student, brought a new twist. During a campus conversation, he handed Paulo a photo taken with his phone. The hooded man, captured in a blurry angle near the library. "I saw him yesterday," James said, nervous. "Think he's following us?" The image, though unclear, confirmed Paulo's worst fears, but it also deepened his bond with James, who offered to keep watching. The alliance, however, left him in a dilemma. Involving a student made him feel responsible for James's safety. That night, sitting by the window with his journal, Paulo wrote about his fear and resolve. The investigation, the break-in, the notes, and Daniel's appearance suggested his quest for self-worth had stirred a web of hostility. He called Elena for guidance, and she suggested the next step might be confronting his past, perhaps tracing the note's origins. As snow fell, illuminated by the city's lights, Paulo felt that Boston, with its history of resilience, was testing his courage. He knew the challenges would only grow, but the letter in his notebook reminded him. He deserved to fight for himself, even if the price was steep. Snow fell in slow flakes over Boston, turning the streets of Back Bay into a white blanket that muffled the city's sounds. Though it couldn't quiet the storm in Paulo Ferreira's mind. Seated in Dr. Elena Carter's office, he clutched his journal tightly, its pages marked by records of the break-in and the notes. It was a Thursday, days after the photo of the hooded man delivered by James, and tension consumed him. The university investigation, Lucas's threats, and the enigmatic presence of Daniel Ortiz placed him in a moral dilemma. Fight for his truth or retreat to avoid further conflict. The interactions around him, layered with nuance, forced him to confront emotions he barely understood. Elena listened intently as Paulo described the new note and the photo, her tone firm yet compassionate. "You're being tested, Paulo," she said, leaning forward. "These threats suggest someone wants to silence you, but also that you're on the right path." The suggestion to confront his past, tracing the note's origins, left him torn. He craved answers, but the fear of exposing more of himself paralyzed him. Elena proposed a technique. Visualize an internal dialogue between the Paulo who submits and the Paulo who resists. "Write it down," she instructed. "See who wins." The task intrigued him, but also terrified him. Could he overcome himself? At the university, interactions turned into a minefield. Sofia approached during a break, her smile fake, offering peace if he dropped an informal complaint about the rumors. "Let's put this behind us, Paulo," she said, her eyes glinting with ulterior motives. He hesitated, the investigation's pressure weighing on him, but the letter in his pocket anchored him. "I won't stay quiet anymore," he replied, his voice low but steady. Sofia stormed off, huffing, and he felt a mix of relief and guilt. Was he being fair in rejecting her, or just feeding the cycle? James, however, brought a deeper emotional dilemma. The student showed up with another photo, this one clearer, depicting the hooded man near Paulo's apartment. "I followed him a bit," James confessed, eyes wide. He disappeared near an abandoned building. The young man's bravery moved him, but it also filled him with fear. Involving James made him feel responsible, and the thought of putting him in danger gnawed at him. "You shouldn't take risks like that," Paulo said, his voice choked. James smiled. "You inspire me, Professor. I want to help." The loyalty touched him, but the dilemma lingered. Protect James or accept his support. At home, family interactions intensified his inner conflicts. During a visit to Dorchester, Teresa prepared tea, her arthritic fingers trembling, while Carlos watched Paulo with concern. "That Daniel guy came by again," Carlos revealed, slamming a hand on the table. "Said you're in trouble. What's going on?" Torn between shielding his parents and seeking support, Paulo shared part of the truth. The toxic friends, the therapy, omitting the threats. Teresa took his hand. "You've always been strong, son. Don't let them break you." The words warmed him, but fearing their involvement, he promised fewer visits, deepening his isolation. The dilemma peaked when Daniel approached again, this time in Boston Common, the wind carrying snowflakes. "Lucas is furious," Daniel said, his tone laced with veiled threat. "But I can get you out of this for a price." Paulo's stomach churned. The price hinted at bribery or silence. He refused, but the offer plunged him into turmoil. Yield to avoid danger or resist and risk more. Walking back, he spotted the hooded man in the distance, confirming he was being watched. The tension suffocated him, yet the letter reminded him of his worth. That night, Paulo sat with his journal, writing the internal dialogue Elena had suggested. The Paulo who submits screamed to give in, while the Paulo who resists demanded courage. Tears fell as he chose resistance, feeling that Boston, with its history of struggle, challenged him to find strength. He called Elena, seeking help to confront Daniel, and decided to face his past, perhaps tracking the abandoned building. As snow covered the window, Paulo knew the dilemmas would shape him, but also lead him to rebirth if he dared to continue. The sky over Boston darkened early that Friday, January 20th, 2004, heavy clouds promising more snow while the wind sliced through the streets of Back Bay like a blade. Paulo Ferreira walked with hesitant steps toward the abandoned building James had mentioned, his journal tucked in his backpack and his phone vibrating with an unanswered call from Elena. The tension that had shadowed him since the apartment break-in now mingled with a dark curiosity. He needed to uncover who was watching him and why. Every shadow in the alleys seemed to hide a threat, and the clues piling up drew him into a dangerous game. The university investigation took on a more sinister edge. During a meeting with Dr. Mitchell, Paulo received a formal warning. "We have evidence of anonymous emails against you, Ferreira. This could escalate." Mitchell handed over a printout of a defamatory message, signed with a pseudonym, alleging Paulo manipulated students, a baseless accusation pointing to Lucas or Sofia. The director pressed him to defend himself, but the lack of proof left him powerless. He suspected Daniel Ortiz was orchestrating it, leveraging his network, and the thought filled him with icy fear. The abandoned building, a dilapidated structure near the harbor, became the next focus of intrigue. Paulo arrived at dusk, the salty air mingling with the scent of rotting wood. With James by his side, despite his protests, he found fresh footprints in the snow and a broken window. Inside, amid debris and graffiti-covered walls, lay an envelope with his name, containing photos of him entering Elena's office, dated weeks earlier. The shock froze him. Someone had been tracking him longer than he'd realized. James, pale, whispered, "This is serious, Professor." The discovery was a clue, but also a warning that danger was closer than he thought. The tension spiked with a new twist. Returning home, Paulo found a message on his answering machine, the voice distorted by a modulator. "You should have taken Daniel's offer. Now your family's at stake." Panic gripped him. Carlos and Teresa could be in danger. He called them, relieved to hear they were safe, but Carlos mentioned another strange visitor, leaving a broken watch as a reminder. Paulo kept the object, sensing it was a coded message, perhaps from Lucas or someone more powerful behind him. Elena, during an emergency session, examined the photos and the message. "This suggests an organization, Paulo," she said, her tone grave. "Someone wants to control you, and the watch might be a deadline." She recommended contacting the police, but Paulo hesitated. Exposing his therapy could ruin his career. The dilemma tore at him: protect himself or others. He chose to investigate alone, asking James to avoid the building. But the young man insisted on helping, sparking an emotional conflict. "I trust you, Professor," James said, his eyes resolute. Paulo relented, torn between gratitude and guilt. Outside, Boston turned into a maze of secrets. Walking by the harbor, Paulo noticed a black car parked too long, its tinted windows concealing the occupant. He jotted the license plate in his journal, feeling each step brought him closer to a perilous truth. The photo of his sessions with Elena suggested his self-discovery was the key. Someone feared what he might uncover about himself and them. He called Elena, seeking help to decipher the watch, and planned a visit to his parents to protect them. That night, sitting by the window with the watch in hand, Paulo felt the weight of his journey. The investigation, the photos, the message, and the car pointed to a larger conspiracy, possibly tied to a past he didn't recall. He wrote in his journal, "Am I being hunted for who I was?" The question haunted him, but the letter in his backpack reminded him of his worth. As snow blanketed Boston, he knew the intrigue would lead to an inevitable confrontation, and that his redemption hinged on facing the unknown with courage. The night of January 22nd, 2004, settled over Boston like a cloak of silence, the accumulated snow reflecting the streetlights' glow in a cold, melancholic shimmer. Paulo Ferreira sat at his parents' kitchen table in Dorchester, the broken watch before him like an enigma he couldn't unravel. The visit to his parents had offered temporary relief, but the connections among the characters around him, Lucas, Sofia, Daniel, James, and even Elena, wove a web of challenges that tested his resilience. The weight of the threats and his quest for answers placed him in a delicate balance between trust and suspicion. Carlos and Teresa, seated across from him, watched Paulo with a mix of pride and worry. Teresa took his hand, her arthritis-scarred fingers trembling, and said, "You're fighting, son, but don't hide anything from us." Carlos, frowning, added, "That watch, it feels like a message. Who would do this?" Paulo hesitated but revealed the photos and the voicemail, omitting the abandoned building to protect them. Carlos's reaction was immediate. He insisted on installing new locks, while Teresa suggested Paulo stay with them. The offer warmed him, but the dilemma of exposing his family made him decline, promising regular visits. His bond with them strengthened, yet the fear of dragging them into danger gnawed at him. At the university, relationships with colleagues grew more complex. Sofia, now teaming up with Daniel in a coordinated tactic, spread further rumors, claiming Paulo used his position to retaliate against old friends. During a break, Daniel approached with a forced smile, offering proof of Paulo's instability, a forged email he claimed to have received. "We can settle this quietly," Daniel said, his eyes glinting with malice. Paulo sensed the trap and refused, but the investigation's pressure isolated him, pushing him to lean on James, whose loyalty deepened. The connection with the student, however, brought a new challenge: how to protect him without pushing him away. Elena, during a session, delved deeper into the watch's meaning. "The broken hand might symbolize a deadline," she suggested, examining it. "Someone wants you to stop, but we don't know why." She proposed exploring Paulo's past, perhaps a traumatic event that drew manipulators like Lucas. The idea unsettled him. He recalled a teenage fight with a friend who betrayed him, but nothing more. Elena encouraged him to dig into it, strengthening their bond as a guide, but the fear of twists held him back. He began jotting fragmented memories in his journal, sensing the past held a key. James, meanwhile, added a new layer of intrigue. He showed up with an audio recording from his phone, captured near the abandoned building, muffled voices mentioning the professor and the plan. "I don't know who they are," James admitted, tense. "But it sounds big." The recording confirmed Paulo was a target of a conspiracy, but it also deepened his tie with James, who offered to investigate further. Paulo's dilemma was clear. Accepting help risked the student, but refusing left him vulnerable. He decided to train James to observe from a distance, balancing gratitude and caution. Outside the university, tension surfaced in casual encounters. Walking through Boston Common, Paulo crossed paths with Marcos Silva, an old colleague who'd worked with Lucas years ago. Marcos, hesitant, whispered, Watch out for Daniel. He's not just a friend of Lucas. The hint suggested Daniel might be tied to something larger, perhaps a manipulation network linked to Paulo's past. He noted the name in his journal, feeling the character's connections closing in like a trap. That night, alone at home, Paulo reread the letter he'd written to himself, the words now a shield against uncertainty. The investigation pressed him, the threats intensified, and his ties with his family, Elena, and James sustained him but also overwhelmed him. He wrote in his journal, "I'm surrounded, but I'm not alone." Gazing out the window, the city's lights shimmered through the snow, and Paulo felt that Boston, with its history of resilience, urged him to unravel the secrets that pursued him, one step at a time. The dawn of January 25th, 2004, brought a Boston blanketed in thick snow, the silence broken only by distant sirens echoing through the streets of Back Bay. Paulo Ferreira woke with his heart racing, the broken watch and photos from Elena's sessions scattered on the table like a map of a battlefield. The university investigation, Lucas's threats, and the investigation into the abandoned building converged on a critical point, forcing him to make decisions that could define his fate. The tension suffocated him, but a growing resolve propelled him forward. At the university, the conflict reached its peak. Dr. Mitchell summoned Paulo for a formal hearing, presenting new evidence. An edited video showing him arguing with Sofia, manipulated to appear aggressive. "This could cost you your job, Ferreira," Mitchell said, his tone sharp. Paulo, stunned, realized Daniel and Sofia had orchestrated the forgery, using 2000s technology to distort the truth. He tried to defend himself, but the lack of concrete proof left him vulnerable. James, present as a witness, offered the recording from the abandoned building, but Mitchell dismissed it as insufficient. Paulo's isolation deepened, and the pressure to yield or fight tore him apart. Outside work, the threat to his family intensified. Visiting Dorchester, Paulo found Carlos with a cut on his hand, explaining that an intruder had tried to break in the night before. "He fled when I yelled," Carlos said, his voice steady but eyes worried. Teresa, in tears, hugged Paulo. "This is because of you, isn't it?" The guilt hit him like a punch, but it also ignited a rage he'd never felt. He promised to hire security, but the incident forced him to reconsider investigating alone. The safety of his parents now depended on his actions. Elena, in a tense session, analyzed the watch and suggested a link to Paulo's past. "The broken hand might mark a specific event," she said, pointing to a date engraved on the back, March 15th, 1995. Paulo froze. It was the day his childhood friend Miguel betrayed him, leaking a secret that humiliated him at school. The memory, long buried, flooded back, suggesting Lucas and Daniel might be tied to that incident. Elena urged him to confront it, but the fear of reopening wounds held him back. "What if it destroys me?" he asked, his voice breaking. The tension culminated when James brought an alarming discovery. He'd tracked the black car near the harbor and found a discarded receipt for a private security firm, Shadow Watch, that hired ex-convicts. "I think Daniel's involved," James said, handing over the paper. The revelation pointed to a professional conspiracy, possibly funded by someone wealthy or influential. Paulo felt the ground shift. His personal struggle had become a power play. He decided to confront Daniel, but the risk of escalating the conflict left him at a crossroads. Act now or wait for more proof. That night, alone at home, Paulo heard a noise at the window, a stone thrown with a note tied to it. "Last warning. Give up." The direct threat made him tremble, but it also motivated him. He called Elena, asking for a strategy, and scheduled a meeting with James to plan the next step. Staring at the photos and the watch, he wrote in his journal, "I'm at the edge, but I won't back down." The city, wrapped in snow, seemed to hold its breath, and Paulo felt that Boston, with its history of resistance, pushed him toward a decisive confrontation. The critical point prepared him for the climax, a battle that would test his worth and courage. The night of January 27th, 2004, descended over Boston like an omen, the snow ceasing to reveal a starry sky that contrasted with the storm raging inside Paulo Ferreira. Seated in his apartment, he held the last warning note and the broken watch, the weight of impending decisions pressing down on him. The university hearing, the attack on his family, and James's revelations had brought him to a breaking point, where inevitable confrontations and critical choices led toward the climax of his journey. The air was thick, and every sound from the street seemed an echo of his fate. The first confrontation erupted at the university. Dr. Mitchell, pressed by new reports, scheduled an emergency meeting with Paulo and Daniel Ortiz present. Daniel, with a calculated smile, presented a forged contract suggesting Paulo had accepted a bribe to silence the rumors. A clear trap. "Sign it, and this ends," Daniel said, sliding the paper forward. Paulo, heart pounding, refused, tossing the contract to the floor. "I won't sell myself," he retorted, his voice steady despite the tremor. Mitchell, furious, postponed the decision, but the tension between them was palpable. James, hidden by the door, recorded the exchange, providing Paulo with vital evidence, but also increasing the risk for both. Outside work, the confrontation with his family was emotionally devastating. Visiting Dorchester, Paulo found Carlos barricading the door with furniture, his eyes inflamed with anger. "A guy showed up again," Carlos said, showing a note with silence scratched across it. Teresa, in tears, begged, "Stay here, Paulo, please." Their love moved him, but the decision to protect them forced him to lie. He said he'd handle it alone, avoiding their involvement. The choice isolated him further, but it strengthened his resolve to end the threats, no matter the cost. The decisive moment came with Elena. During a late-night session, she revealed a discovery after investigating the watch's date. In 1995, Miguel, the traitorous friend, had been paid by a relative of Lucas to spread Paulo's secret, sparking a cycle of manipulation that persisted to this day. "Lucas and Daniel might be avenging something bigger," Elena said, her eyes serious. Paulo froze. The betrayal by Miguel hadn't been random but part of a long-term plan. Elena suggested confronting Lucas directly but warned, "This could expose you completely." The dilemma consumed him. Risk everything for justice or retreat to survive. He chose confrontation, feeling his redemption hinged on it. The climax neared with a risky encounter. Paulo, with James and a recording for protection, arranged a meeting with Lucas near the abandoned building by the harbor. The night was frigid, the sound of waves crashing against the piers amplifying the tension. Lucas arrived, flanked by Daniel and two burly men, likely from Shadow Watch. "You think you can challenge me?" Lucas snarled, his face twisted with hate. Paulo, with a steady voice, threw the truth back at him. "This started with Miguel, didn't it? You've always hated me for it." The revelation stunned Lucas, who hesitated, but Daniel intervened, ordering the thugs to advance. The physical clash was brief but intense. James yelled, distracting the men with the recording, allowing Paulo to escape with a damaged tape. He ran home, heart pounding, knowing the partial evidence might be enough to expose the conspiracy. He called Elena, reporting the incident, and she promised to help reconstruct the proof. As the city slept under the stars, Paulo wrote in his journal, "I faced my fear. Now it's win or fall." The moment of decision pushed him to the edge, preparing him for the climax where his courage would be tested against the forces pursuing him. The night of January 28, 2004, plunged Boston into an oppressive silence, the temperature dropping as a thick fog rose from the harbor, wrapping the streets of Back Bay in a veil of mystery. Paulo Ferreira stood in his apartment, heart racing, clutching the damaged tape and broken watch as if they were relics of a personal war. The tension had reached its peak. Lucas and Daniel's conspiracy, his family's safety at risk, and the university pressure pushed him to the edge. Every decision now was a taut rope, ready to snap, preparing him for the resolution that would define his rebirth. The morning brought a decisive confrontation. With Elena's help, Paulo took the partially recovered tape to an audio technician in the city, a trusted friend named Robert. The analysis revealed fragments, voices confirming that Shadow Watch had been hired by a boss to intimidate Paulo, and a mention of family money, a clue pointing to a wealthy relative of Lucas. The shock left him pale, but it also fueled his resolve. Elena, beside him, said, "This is bigger than we thought. We need to expose it all." Their bond solidified as a pillar, but the risk of retaliation made him tremble. The danger crept closer to his family once more. While Paulo was with Robert, Carlos called, his voice hoarse with panic. "They came back, Paulo. They broke the window." He raced to Dorchester, finding Teresa in tears and Carlos wielding a baseball bat, his face flushed with anger. A note on the table read, "You have 24 hours." The direct threat paralyzed him, but it also forced him to act. He called the police, overcoming his reluctance, and requested patrols in the area. The decision eased his mind, but the fear of failing his parents consumed him, heightening the tension. At the university, the crisis hit its peak. Dr. Mitchell, pressured by anonymous complaints, scheduled a final hearing, demanding the presence of Paulo, Daniel, and Sofia. Daniel presented the forged contract again, but Paulo, with James's help, played the restored recording, exposing Shadow Watch's voices. The silence in the room was deafening, and Mitchell, stunned, suspended Daniel and Sofia pending an external investigation. The victory was partial. Paulo kept his job, but Daniel's fury promised retaliation. James, at his side, whispered, "You did it, Professor," strengthening their alliance, though the risk to the student worried him. The final showdown loomed when Lucas contacted him directly. In a tense phone call, Lucas roared, "You think you can take me down? My uncle won't let this slide." The mention of his uncle, a local magnate, confirmed the family conspiracy, and Paulo felt the weight of a powerful enemy. He arranged a meeting at the harbor, determined to end it. Elena warned, "Bring proof and backup." This could be a trap. With James recording from a distance and the police on alert, Paulo prepared, armed with his journal and the tape. The tension was palpable. Each step brought him closer to a conclusion that could save or destroy him. That night, gazing out the window, Paulo spotted the black car parked again, its headlights cutting through the fog. He wrote in his journal, "The time has come. Win or fall." The city, steeped in its history of struggle, seemed to witness his moment of greatest vulnerability. The maximum tension prepared him for the climax, a confrontation with Lucas and his uncle, where his courage, supported by Elena, James, and the law, would face the legacy of manipulation that had haunted him for years. The air was charged with promise and peril, and Paulo knew the next step would define who he truly was. The night of January 29, 2004, turned Boston's harbor into a stage of tension, the thick fog blending with the salty scent as waves crashed against the piers with an almost menacing rhythm. Paulo Ferreira advanced with determined steps, his journal in his backpack, the restored tape in his pocket, and his heart pounding with a mix of fear and courage. The encounter with Lucas and his uncle, the magnate Victor Almeida, marked the climax of his journey, a confrontation that would bring answers and a conclusion defining his rebirth. The city, with its history of resilience, seemed to hold its breath. Lucas and Victor waited near the abandoned building, illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight. Victor, a 55-year-old man with harsh features and an expensive suit, displayed a cold smile. "You're stubborn, Ferreira," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "This all started because your father humiliated my brother decades ago." Lucas carried on the legacy. The revelation hit Paulo like a blow. The vendetta traced back to a business feud between Carlos and an Almeida, echoing into his childhood with Miguel. Lucas, beside him, laughed. "And you fell right into it." The long-standing betrayal left him stunned, but it also ignited his rage. With the tape in hand, Paulo replied, "It's over, Lucas. The Shadow Watch, the notes, it's all recorded." He played the recording, and Daniel's and the thugs' voices echoed, exposing the conspiracy. Victor frowned but tried to maintain control. Proof without context is worthless. At that moment, sirens pierced the air. The police, alerted by James, arrived, led by a detective named Harris. James, hidden with a recorder, handed over a copy of the tape, confirming Shadow Watch's link to Victor. The tension erupted when Daniel appeared, furious, lunging at Paulo, but was restrained by the officers. The emotional resolution came with his family. As Victor and Lucas were handcuffed, Paulo called Carlos and Teresa, relieved to hear the police were protecting them. "It's over, Dad," he said, his voice choked. Carlos replied with pride, "You proved your worth, son." Teresa, crying, added, "We're so proud." Their love, paired with the victory, brought tears to Paulo's eyes, healing a wound he'd carried since childhood. He realized his rebirth wasn't just about winning, but about reconnecting with those who loved him. At the university, the impact was immediate. Dr. Mitchell, forced by the evidence, permanently dismissed Daniel and Sofia and praised Paulo's courage in an assembly. James, by his side, received recognition for his help, solidifying their friendship. Elena, in a final session, reflected, "You faced your past and won. Now build your future." Their bond evolved into a healing partnership, and Paulo felt he could finally trust himself. The conclusion brought emotional twists. As Victor was led away, he muttered, "This isn't over," hinting at potential allies returning, but Paulo, now stronger, remained unshaken. He visited Boston Common at dawn, the sun dispelling the fog, and wrote in his journal, "I am enough." The city, with its historic streets, witnessed his transformation from victim to survivor. He decided to seek healthy relationships, starting by inviting James and Elena for coffee, a first step toward a new life. Walking home, Paulo felt a weight lift. The battle against toxic forces had shaped him, and the support from his family, James, and Elena had sustained him. The climax wasn't just an external victory, but an internal reclaiming. He was reborn, ready to leave the past behind and embrace a future of self-worth. Boston's lights glowed in the distance, and Paulo knew, for the first time, he walked with his head held high. The dawn of February 1st, 2004, brought a renewed Boston, the sun melting the accumulated snow and revealing the streets of Back Bay in a soft glow. Paulo Ferreira walked through Boston Common, the fresh air filling his lungs as the weight of months of struggle finally seemed to lift. The confrontation at the harbor, the arrest of Victor and Lucas, and the restoration of his life at the university marked the end of a toxic cycle and the beginning of a new era. Sitting on a bench with his journal open, he reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a victim of manipulation into a man who had found his worth. Paulo's reflections ran deep. He thought about Miguel's betrayal, amplified by the Almeida family's vendetta, and how it had shaped him to seek validation in destructive relationships. Therapy with Elena had taught him that self-awareness was the key to breaking that pattern. Each page of his journal, from "I deserve more" to "I am enough," was proof of his growth. The bond with his family, strengthened by Carlos and Teresa's support, and his friendship with James, which had grown into loyalty, anchored him in a sense of belonging he'd never known. Elena, as a mentor, had guided him beyond survival to the possibility of thriving. The victory at the university brought a sense of justice. The permanent dismissal of Daniel and Sofia, combined with Mitchell's public recognition, restored his reputation. But Paulo knew the true triumph was internal. He had written a thank you letter to James, acknowledging the student's role in his redemption, and planned to expand his classes to include themes of resilience, inspiring others to face their own challenges. The lingering threat from Victor, though present, no longer shook him. He had learned to turn fear into strength. The call to action emerged from his reflections. Paulo decided to start a support group in the community, a safe space for those suffering from toxic relationships, drawing from his own experience. He envisioned meetings in Boston Common, where participants could share stories and healing strategies, perhaps even inviting Elena as a facilitator. Writing in his journal, he noted, "I can't change the past, but I can help shape the future." The idea filled him with purpose. Turning his pain into hope for others was the final step of his rebirth. Paulo, Elena, and James would continue the journey, expanding the group and helping more people break free from abusive cycles. That afternoon, Paulo met James and Elena at the agreed-upon cafe. Over a hot cup of coffee, he shared his plan for the support group. James, enthusiastic, offered to help with technology, while Elena suggested contacts in mental health. Their laughter filled the air, and Paulo felt, for the first time, he was building genuine connections. He raised his cup in a silent toast, to the past overcome, the present won, and the future he would shape. Heading home with his journal under his arm, Paulo paused to look at Boston's lights at night. He wrote his final entry. "My struggle is over, but my mission begins. May others find the worth I have found." The journey had taken him from a cycle of emotional abuse to a rebirth of self-worth, and he knew his story could inspire. The call to action wasn't just for himself, but for anyone who read his words, an invitation to recognize their own value and seek help as he had. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, where we explore overcoming and healing. Like the video, share it with those who need it, and watch the next episode, where we'll see Paulo expanding his support group. His journey of rebirth continues. Join us.